Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now come to Australian tanks. Now, I did look at Australian tanks many years ago, and thankfully Gaijin have added many of these tanks in the intervening years, albeit as premium and event tanks. But there are still a few Australian tanks and other vehicles that still need adding to War Thunder. So just a brief bit of background on Australian tank development. When Australia first entered the war on the 3rd of September 1939, there was no domestic tank industry, and indeed its heavy industry was more limited than that of the UK or Canada, which makes sense because it has a population just shy of 7 million at the start of the war, and this on the face of it would make Australia a rather unlikely country to develop tanks. Despite this, Australia technically did have some familiarity with tanks, starting in World War I when Australian troops had managed to capture a German tank named Mephisto, one of just 20 A7Vs that the Germans would produce in World War I, with this being shipped back to Australia in 1919, where it still survives to this day, though of course this was a trophy tank and was never actually used by the Australians. On a more practical level, however, in 1929 Australia did acquire 4 modified British medium Mark II tanks, with these being armed with a 47mm 3-pounder gun in a turret, along with 5 7.7mm Vickers machine guns. With the tank being operated by 5 crew and having a top speed of 15 miles per hour or 24 kilometers an hour, but a limited armour thickness maxing out at just 6.25mm, making it very vulnerable to enemy fire, but this would still make for a good starting Australian tank at 1.0. However, these 4 tanks would be the only Australian tanks in service until 1939, when 10 British Mark 6A light tanks would arrive in Australia, with these being armed with one 50 cal Vickers machine gun, which has a maximum penetration in game of 24mm at 100 metres, while a 7.7mm Vickers machine gun is also carried, with 3 crew manning the tank, with it having a top speed of 35 miles per hour or 56 kilometers an hour, and a maximum armour thickness of 14mm. And again, this could be added at 1.0, or at least given an Australian camouflage scheme should this be added as a British tank in the British tech tree. Thus, Australia would enter the war with just 14 tanks available, with the 4 medium tanks being old and obsolete, and the 10 light tanks only useful for reconnaissance. Without the ability to produce tanks of their own, Australia would have to rely on deliveries of British and later American tanks. But with these nations having their own problems, it would take a while for tanks to be delivered in large numbers. Thus in 1940 work would begin on an Australian designed tank, with a hope for it to be ready by the end of 1941, with Australia requesting a tank design expert to be sent to Australia from Britain. And subsequently a Colonel W.D. Watson from the Royal Artillery was sent out from the 4th of October 1940, and on 11th of November 1940 the final specifications would be laid out, with Watson placed in charge of designing the new tank when he arrived in December 1940, having stopped off in America to observe tank developments there. This would result in the first Australian-designed tank, the AC-1 Sentinel, with a prototype ready by January 1942, which was a remarkable achievement considering Australia had never designed or built a tank before, and the hull was cast as a single piece. Again, a big achievement for Australian industry, and 65 AC-1s would be built by June 1943, meaning Australia would have tanks available to fight against Japan, who had now entered the war. Now, luckily for us, the AC-1 was added to War Thunder back in 2021, albeit as an event tank, being added at Tier 2 Battle Rating 3.0, and while I don't have it unlocked, it does seem to have decent armour, a good 2-pounder 40mm gun, and good top speed, making it a decent tank in game. However, even as the first AC-1s were being built, it was seen that the 2-pounder, while able to deal with Japanese tanks, was now obsolete against modern German tanks, and that the 57mm 6-pounder gun would also be obsolete before long, with the 76.2mm 17-pounder being the preferable weapon to upgrade to. But as this was not available at the time, it was decided to mount the 87.6mm 25-pounder gun as a stopgap measure, as this gun was being produced in Australia at the time. So that brings us to our first completely new Australian tank, which is the Sentinel AC-1 E2 prototype, which was the second Sentinel prototype that was built, and this was used to test the 25-pounder. Now, we don't have the 25-pounder in-game, so we will have to use Gaijin's armour penetration calculator and historical records to determine its effectiveness. But we also need to determine what 25-pounder was used. As it turns out, this was not quite as easy as I first expected. You see, Tank Encyclopedia says a length 27 25-pounder was fitted in June 1942, which solves that issue quite easily, but according to the book Fire, the 25-pounder in Australian service, a longer barrel length 34 gun was fitted in September 1942, using, quote, the same cradle and cylinder block under the barrel as previously used with the length 27 barrel in June-July, unquote. Which sounds like both guns were fitted to the same AC-1, but regardless, with the rest of the stats being similar aside from the gun, this potentially gives us some more options. Now, according to the aforementioned book, the length 34 gun as expected has a much better performance. Again, quote, the average muzzle velocity was 656 meters a second, an increase of 138 meters a second over a new Mark II/1 length 27 caliber barrel, unquote. Now, on the face of things, this would make it a fair bit more powerful than a regular 25-pounder, but in fairness, they seem to be comparing the AP shell fired with a supercharge and supplemental charge to the highest muzzle velocity of the HE shell with a supercharge, which is 518 meters a second, while the AP shell could reach 563 meters a second with a supercharge. So it's more like a 93 meters a second increase, which is still good to be fair, but not as great as it might first appear. Putting this into Gaijin's penetration calculator, for the length 27 this means that the AP shell, weighing 20 pounds or 9.07 kilograms, has an armour penetration at point blank range of around 87 to 96 millimeters. So similar to the 2-pounder, though with a larger shell. Though I've also found a firing table that claims an 87mm penetration at a 30-degree angle. So it's possible that the shell is actually even more powerful than what Gaijin's calculator suggests. While the length 34's penetration is given as around 110 to 120mm in Gaijin's calculator, which is a much better performance and is far better than the best shell available to the 2-pounder. Of course, it could also fire a 25-pound or 11.3kg HE shell, but these would contain less than 1 kilogram of explosive, so would be unlikely to be much of a threat to enemy tanks, but would be useful against unarmoured or lightly armoured vehicles. And a smoke shell was also available, and interestingly, a HES shell was also developed for the post-war period, but this probably shouldn't be used by this tank as it was retired by the end of World War II, and unfortunately, while a H shell was in development, this was never finished, leaving us with just 3 types of shell to use. As for the tank itself, the only other change is the turret being enlarged and a modified recoil system fitted, but the rest of the stats should be broadly the same as the regular Sentinel AC-1, having a maximum of 64mm of armour for the hull, top speed of 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour, and 5 crew. In-game, I could see the length 27 version working at 3.0, and the length 34 at 3.3, as these are essentially the same tank as the AC-1 but fitted with a much better armament, being capable of dealing with more heavily armoured tanks, though likely with a worse fire rate than the 2-pounder. But either way, it would be nice to see these unusual prototypes in War Thunder. In real life, this was only used as a test bed for firing tests, and these seem to have been successful, and there were plans to produce an AC-1 with the 25-pounder as the AC-1B, though this never actually happened, while the AC-1A was intended to be armed with a 57mm 6-pounder gun, though it appears that this wasn't even tested, and instead work would move on to developing an improved tank design. So you might expect this new tank design to be the AC-2, but this was actually a simplified design of the AC-1 with thinner armour that's never progressed beyond the drawing board. So the next Australian tank design is actually the AC-3 Thunderbolt, although there was also an AC-3 Scorpion which was to be a standard AC-1 tank with a Pratt & Whitney radio engine, but again this didn't progress beyond drawings. The Thunderbolt was again to be armed with the 25-pounder gun, but this time the regular length 27 version, meaning its armour penetration at point blank range has gone from what Gaijin's calculator suggests is 110 to 120mm to around 85 to 95mm. Though again, like I said, there is a firing table suggesting 87mm at a 30-degree angle. So this is still pretty good, but now more on par with the 2-pounder's best APC-BC shell, which penetrates 89mm at point blank range. Aside from this, the whole machine gun position was removed to make room for more ammunition, though the coaxial machine gun remains in place. The engine, meanwhile, is the Perrier Cadillac, which is essentially the same three V8 engines of the AC-1, but in a different arrangement, more like that on the Chrysler A57 Multibank, which took up less space and boosted the power output to 395 horsepower with high-octane petrol, though the top speed should remain the same at 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour, but due to having the same weight, this should give a decent boost to the vehicle's manoeuvrability. Lastly, the armour still maxes out at around 64mm, though with some minor differences such as an enlarged mantlet, and the crew is now reduced to 4 due to losing the whole machine gun, which in-game is a disadvantage as it means the tank can now be knocked out easier due to crew losses. In-game, I could see the AC-3 being added at 3.3, being similar to the AC-1 in many respects, but with a technically better gun and better mobility, as well as better protection due to the removal of the whole machine gun, and it would be nice for this rather important step in Australian tank development to be added to War Thunder. In real life, 400 AC-1s were ordered on the 27th of May 1942, before the gunnery trials with the 25-pounder on the AC-1 on the 29th of June 1942 had even taken place, with the pilot model being ready by January 1943, and by May 1943, 146 holes and 106 turrets had been cast, showing that production was being undertaken at a fast pace, and again remember, Australia hadn't even built tanks just a few short years earlier, so again this was a massive achievement for the country. Unfortunately for us, the one pilot is all that would be built, which still survives to this day at the Toreno Resource Centre at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. However, enough components from the AC-3 project survived in storage and at various firing ranges for the Melbourne Tank Museum to build their own AC-3, but that museum closed in 2006, with the tank being auctioned off to a private collector, though recently it was announced that this tank was going to be restored to running condition, so that is something we will have to keep an eye on. So the AC-3 would ultimately not go into service, but there was a fourth project, the AC-4, which was intended to fit the 17-pounder. The prototype for this was based on the E1, which was the first AC-1 prototype, and work steadily progressed with the turret ring increased from 54 to 64 inches, and a new larger turret was fitted, but there wasn't any 17-pounders available to actually test if the recoil from the powerful gun could be absorbed by the tank. Now this was a bit of an issue and could have delayed the project, as the next most powerful gun that was being tested on a tank, the 25-pounder, while quite powerful, wasn't equal to the recoil force of a 17-pounder. However, the Australians managed to come up with a workaround. Basically, if one 25-pounder wasn't enough, what about two? This leads us to this double-barreled monstrosity, being armed with two standard 25-pounder guns, which actually gives 20% more recoil force than the 17-pounder, and as a reminder, the standard 25-pounder can penetrate 87mm at a 30-degree angle, at point-blank range. And as there are two of these guns, you can either fire them simultaneously to absolutely mess up any enemy tank that you can penetrate, or fire them one at a time, meaning that one will be reloading while the other is still available to provide covering fire. So this seems like a brilliant tank to have in game, but there is one possible problem. Basically, the two 25-pounders took up most of the space in the turret, to the point that when doing firing tests, they had to fire the gun via a lanyard. Now, to be fair, it's possible that there technically is room within the turret for at least one crew member, though of course during the firing tests it wasn't required for someone to be in there, so it's probably just safer to use the lanyard. But if there is technically room, it might possibly work in game, though maybe with just one or two crew members present, which would bring the crew down to 3 or 4, with a driver, whole machine gunner, and a commander and maybe loader in the turret, and of course I suspect the reload rate is going to be severely impacted. Meanwhile, the rest of the stats should be about the same as the AC-1, with 64mm of armour and a top speed of 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour. This could probably work at 3.3 to 3.7, as the two guns would make this a deadly tank, but again this would no doubt have a horrible reload time, and its armour would be more vulnerable at the higher battle ratings. But I think this would be a great event or premium tank to have in game. So in real life, the two 25-pounders were used for firing tests, simulating the 17-pounder in October 1942, But within a month, a domestically produced 17-pounder would be delivered for testing, and this was fitted to the tank, becoming the first Allied tank to be fitted with such a weapon, barring the A-30 Challenger that received one in August 1942 in the UK, and firing tests were successfully carried out on the 11th of November 1942. So you might be thinking that there isn't really anything else to cover with the AC-4, as we already have it in-game, and that is technically true as it was added as a premium tank at the same time as the rest of the British tech tree all the way back in 2015, as part of the 1.55 Royal Armour update. However, as you might have noticed, the hull is based off of the AC-3 Thunderbolt, and is sort of how it was intended to go into production, but the production never actually occurred, meaning that the prototype based on the E1 is the version we should have in-game. Now obviously this would work very similarly to the in-game Sentinel AC-4, but with the less powerful engine of the AC-1, and worse protection due to retaining the whole machine gun position, though the machine gun isn't fitted on the prototype and is just an open hull, but does ruin the almost fully sloped frontal hull of the in-game AC-4, while still retaining a maximum armour thickness of 64mm, a 5-man crew, and a top speed of 30 mph or 48 km/h. In-game, I would actually like to see this added as a regular vehicle, probably at 4.7 to 5.0, between the Sherman Firefly and Challenger, as this is less protected and a little bit less mobile than the premium version, but has an extra crew member to boost survivability, and overall I think it would be great to have the actual AC-4 prototype as it existed in real life. And honestly, if the in-game version wasn't a premium, I would probably recommend it getting the same treatment as the Japanese R2Y2 jets, and some of the German tanks like the Tiger II 105, Panther II and Karelian. So in real life, Australia seemed to have a whole bunch of decent tank designs, and the will and ability to produce them, which was a massive achievement for the country. However, as impressive as all of this was, and as dire as the situation may have been when development started in 1940, by 1943 the original Sentinel AC-1 was obsolete, and the AC-3 and 4, while extremely impressive tanks, were still in the prototype stage and likely wouldn't start mass production until late 1943 at the earliest, and it's possible that it wouldn't actually start until 1944. And the AC-4, while well suited for fighting German tanks, wouldn't have the opportunity as Australian ground forces were pulled back to the Pacific in January 1943, and so this tank would just be massive overkill against Japanese tanks. The situation with regards to Japan had also lessened, with the threat of any Japanese invasion of Australia long since past, and foreign tanks from America and Britain were now available in great numbers, with Australia at the beginning of 1943 having 304 British Matilda Mark IIs, while 260 M3 light tanks, 757 M3 medium tanks, and 138 Marmon Harrington light tanks from America were available, for a total of 1,459 tanks. At the same time, only 4 AC-1s were available for immediate service. Thus, support for a domestic Australian tank program began to wane, and before long the Americans started to put pressure on Australia to abandon the tank program and focus on improving logistics within Australia itself to cope with the increasing Allied troops in the country, with the idea that M4 Shermans would be sent instead to replace these Australian-built tanks. So ultimately, on the 14th of October 1943, the Australia Cruiser Tank program was halted, and an order for 310 Shermans placed. It's easy to understand why this cancellation came about in the short term, what with the amount of tanks available and the prospect of even more arriving, but as it turns out, only 2 Shermans would be sent for testing, and Australia had to soldier on with the old Matildas, with their 2-pounder gun that was ill-suited for anti-infantry work, as well as the older but still decent M3 medium tanks. And eventually Australia resorted to ordering 500 Churchill tanks, though with the war starting to come to an end, there was less of a need for these tanks, and this order was eventually reduced to just 51. In hindsight, it seems that the AC-3 at the very least would have made for a great Australian tank, well suited for the conditions that they were fighting in, able to take out infantry and tanks alike, and perhaps Australia could have had its own small homegrown tank industry, serving Asia and the Pacific in the aftermath of World War II. That said, its tank development program wasn't a complete waste, as no doubt the program and the techniques used for producing tanks did wonders for Australia and its industry, while Colonel Watson would return to the UK, where his knowledge of fitting the 17-pounder to the Sentinel would garner a lot of interest, and would be instrumental in the creation of the Sherman Firefly, meaning that the Australian tank programme did go on to have a massive effect on British tank development. There would also be modifications of some of the foreign tanks that Australia used, like the Matilda Mark II being fitted with flamethrowers and dozer blades. But the dozer blades could just be a modification, and the flamethrowers unfortunately replaced the main armament, making them wholly unsuited for adding to the game. Australia did also use a few other foreign tanks that haven't been mentioned, including captured Italian M1139s, French Renault R35s, and of course many other British and American tanks, including at least one Crusader that was sent to Australia, but these could be represented through Australian camouflage schemes on existing vehicles if needed. So that's more or less it for Australian tanks, though there was also the Australian Experimental Light Tank Programme, or AELT, but this seems to have never been armed and the whole project was terminated after its first test run, but it does sort of still exist in a very run-down fashion, and if it had gotten a bit more development, it might have been suitable for adding to the game. So moving on from Australian tanks, we actually have a couple of examples of tank destroyer or SPG type vehicles, starting with this LP2 armed with the 40mm 2-pounder gun. Now the LP2 or Local Pattern 2 was basically an improved version of the LP1, which was itself a copy of a Bren Carrier No. 2 Mark 1 that had been imported from the UK in 1940, and the Australians mounted the 2-pounder, turning this vehicle into a pretty decent tank destroyer, with the 2-pounder in-game having a penetration of 77mm at 500 metres, with its solid shot APC-BC shell, which is a pretty good penetration, while its APHE shell penetrates 49mm at the same distance, but unfortunately this only has 21 grams of TNT equivalent explosive mass, while a Bren gun was also supposed to be carried. Unfortunately, armour is very light, maxing out at just 10mm for the vehicle itself, and I doubt the gun shield is much better, and it is of course open-topped, leaving the forecrew extremely vulnerable to enemies, though it should be fairly easy to conceal due to its small size. Lastly, the top speed is 20 mph or 32 km/h, which isn't too bad, but certainly isn't the fastest top speed at the low tiers. In-game, I could see this being added at 1.0 to 1.3, having an extremely good gun, but being very vulnerable. But I could see this having some success in the early tiers in the ambush role, and I think this would make for a very good starting tank destroyer in the British tech tree. In real life, the prototype would undergo trials in February to March 1941, and subsequently 200 of these vehicles would be ordered, the first being delivered in May 1942. However, these vehicles ultimately never saw combat, instead being used as training vehicles in Australia. We do also have at least one example of an SPG type vehicle in the form of the Yeramba, the name being derived from an Aborigine word for an instrument that was used for throwing spears. And this is technically a Cold War vehicle, but stats-wise is very much a World War II vehicle, and this came about in July 1949 when approval was given to convert an M3 Grant chassis into an SPG, with firing trials carried out in December 1949, and due to the success of these firing trials, in February 1950 approval was given to convert a further 13 M3A5 Grants to this configuration. So the main armament is the 25-pounder, which has a penetration at a 30-degree angle of 74mm at 500 metres, when using a supercharge, and if a supercharge and supplemental charge is used, this could actually go up to 81mm, which would make this a fairly deadly weapon to most low-tier enemies. And it could also fire smoke and HE shells, while a HESH shell was developed for the post-war period, and might be possible to add. And the gun itself has an elevation of up to 40 degrees, and a horizontal traverse of 20 degrees each way, while two 7.7mm Bren guns could also be used for close-in defence. Armour as to be expected isn't the best, maxing out at around 38mm, while of course the fighting compartment is open-topped, making this a very easy target for aircraft, while the top speed should remain at 25 mph or 40 km/h, and a crew of 6 manned the vehicle. In-game, I could see the Yeramba working at around 2.3, between the Daimler Mark II and the Archer, giving us a decent vehicle with a good armament at the lower tiers, and would be more user-friendly for new players than the Archer with its backwards-facing armament, and it would be nice for this lesser-known Australian vehicle to be added in-game. In real life, only 14 Yerambas would be built, and these wouldn't see any combat before being declared obsolete in 1957, though a few of these still survive in Australia today, including at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum. So lastly, for Australian vehicles, we have this heavy armoured car, otherwise known as the Rhino, which began development in 1941 and resulted in a prototype being constructed in 1942 based on the Canadian military pattern or CMP truck chassis. Now, as the name suggests, this vehicle is rather heavy at 8.5 tonnes, and this would no doubt affect mobility, with the top speed of the original CMP truck being 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers an hour, but I seriously doubt the Rhino would get anywhere near this top speed except in ideal conditions. However, a lot of the weight is to do with its armour, which was specified to protect against 20mm AP shells, and as such comes in at a maximum of 30mm for the front and is pretty well sloped, making this a very well protected vehicle from the front, though the sides and rear are less well protected and are not sloped, and normal tank guns will not have much difficulty punching through its armour. As for the rest of its stats, it has a 2-pounder mounted in the turret, along with one 7.7mm Vickers machine gun, and 4 crew. In-game, I think this would work at 1.3, having a decent gun and good armour protection from the front, and while not able to do well in stand-up fights, it should do well as an aggressive reconnaissance vehicle, and it would be nice for this Australian armoured car to be added in War Thunder. In real life, only one prototype of the armoured car was produced, and the design was not adopted for service, while a second prototype was conceived as an open-topped APC-type vehicle, but this wasn't adopted either. So that brings us to the end of this episode looking at Australian World War II tanks, and I'd be interested to see your views on these vehicles in the comments below. For the next episode, I will likely return to some of the non-German major nations and start covering their vehicles that I haven't looked at yet, but we will have to see how things pan out. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the episode, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Toreno, and I'll see you next time.